Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Wilson, class of 1981, and a lawyer at a law firm, Covington & Burling in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Lady Justice Balancing the Scales panel. We're going to balance the scales this hour, so we're going to get a lot of work done. Two quick reminders. First of all, immediately following the end of the session, we'll convene on the front steps of the 62 Center for a group photograph to commemorate this historic event. So when they have the next one in 50 years, we'll have this photo of this wonderful group. I have the honor of introducing this panel as a proud member of the We Lead Advisory Board. And if you've heard already, we're looking for more financial support to help assist with wonderful events like this that focus on the power of women at Williams. So if you have any questions, feel free to tap me on the shoulder or we can talk at dinner later tonight. We've made a lot of progress, but we can always use more help. So just a couple of personal notes. My class, the class of 1981, was the first class to achieve gender parity in the admissions class. We were 48% women, 52% men. And I had my daughter reality check that for me in the Williams record. She's class of 2025. We didn't, however, have many women professors. We had some, but not many. And while I was at Williams, the field of women's studies was beginning to take off at universities and colleges around the country, but Williams did not yet have a formal program. So with the help of brave people like Nancy McIntyre and history Professor Peter Frost, I was able to create the first contract major in women's studies before there was a formal program. And the college has made enormous strides since then. And when I look at the college catalog and the biography of Professor Sarah Dubow, I just marvel at the diversity of offerings in the area of gender, women's, and sexuality studies. It's incredible. So I am so pleased to be able to introduce this panel to be moderated by Professor Dubow. And let me now turn it over to Cynthia Suhu, class of 1988, Rachel Levinson Waldman, class of 1995, and moderator, history professor Sarah Dubow, class of 1991.
Thanks. This is working? Yes. Great. Okay. It's so nice to see all of you here, and it's great to be on this panel. We've had a couple of really good conversations and Google Doc exchanges. And so I know that you're going to learn a lot from hearing about all of their work, and we're also really looking forward to hearing your questions as well. As we were thinking about sort of what are the intersections between their work and what are the themes that connect it, I was thinking about the ways in which you both work in areas of public law that are really deeply engaged with questions of democracy and human rights and the Constitution. And I can't speak for all of you, I'll speak for myself. I feel like over the last few years, I've had more conversations than ever kind of about what is the state of those things. How is democracy doing? How are human rights doing? How is the Constitution working as a tool to protect both? And so I'm hoping to really hear from both of you about your work in those areas. How is the Constitution still an effective protector of democracy and human rights? Is democracy in good shape? What are you seeing kind of from your position? And I guess I'll start with Rachel first and ask, in the world of sort of national security and surveillance, Cindy works in the world of sort of gender justice, reproductive justice, and more academic perspective. And so Rachel, I guess I'll start with you and ask, how does the current state of surveillance and national security kind of implicate democratic values and the protection of human rights? It's a big question. You can attack it from any angle you want. The way that we're thinking about this panel is that we'll begin with some really big framing questions. I have a lot of questions, but we'll begin with two really big framing questions and then sort of see from the audience if people want to respond to those or ask questions at that point, and then I have a million other questions as well. So I'll start with Rachel. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And let me just give like a, super quick, just a minute of quick background on sort of what I do and the perspective that I bring to this question that Sarah posed. So I'm a lawyer, probably, obviously. I work with the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a a nonprofit organization. It's affiliated with NYU Law School. I'm in our DC office. And the way I always describe it is sort of it's dedicated to a progressive vision of the Constitution and to kind of small d democratic values and kind of making democracy function in a variety of different ways. Through different, so probably a lot of people who've heard of it through our kind of voter rights and voting protection work. I'm with another kind of policy program at the Brennan Center called Liberty and National Security. So we work on issues related to civil liberties, national security, the intersection of those, and more broadly, policing and technology and protection of civil liberties and civil rights. So I very much bring a sort of civil liberties, civil rights lens to these questions about surveillance, national security, democratic values, all of those things. And, you know, right to your question, I think there are kind of so many ways to approach this question and so many aspects of it. And so I was sort of thinking like how to crystallize at least one part of it and sort of be able to have a discussion about it. And I think the way that I think about it, or at least one way to think about it, is that, you know, the question is, how does surveillance especially kind of implicate democratic values? Surveillance rewards conformity, and surveillance punishes difference and dissent. And that is in a lot of ways the purpose of surveillance. There are other kinds of surveillance, right? You know, there is public health surveillance, which serves a very different purpose. There are other reasons to gather information. But when you're talking about surveillance through a law enforcement lens or a national security lens, it is there to look for difference and to look for something outside the norm, and then potentially to penalize it or punish it in some way. Democracies, as we all know, right, very much including the United States, are not perfect, right? They are not static. They are ideally kind of, you know, they are a project in progress, right? And from the beginning, there have been many, many things to try to continue to fix and change about the democracy and the sort of like small L liberal democracy that we live in, right? And ideally, a core democratic value, I think, is protection of the minority, of minorities. And there's so many different ways to think about, you know, and that shifts, right? Who's sort of occupying the status of a minority, or who or what minority communities might be sort of particularly in need of protection or shelter at any moment. But I think there is no way to reach for those additional protections if we are in a society of constant surveillance. And that is partly because one of the sort of, shifts that we've seen, right, is what's illegal and what's legal, right? And there are so many norms and values that we have that don't necessarily kind of accord with what is legal and illegal, right? So obviously, to start at the founding, slavery was legal for a long time, right? And if you are pushing against slavery as a norm and as a legal norm, how are you going to do that? You're going to try to get together with people, you're going to organize, you're going to do things that are illegal under that legal framework, right? And surveillance is a very powerful tool to punish the work that pushes against slavery. In many, even thinking about very recent history, right? There are a lot of intimate relationships that have only recently become legal, right? Anti-miscegenation laws are a very recent relic. Anti-sodomy laws, even I was just sort of reading about bans on cross-dressing. Right now, I'm from Texas. Texas has basically just criminalized being transgender, effectively. You cannot seek the needed medical care and psychological support. And I have very, very close friends in my home state who are very directly affected by this. And the ways to enforce those laws, the anti-sodomy laws, anti-transgender laws, laws really about like who can you have in your life and how do they live their freest life, those are, I think, very difficult to impossible to kind of fully realize under a system of total surveillance. There's always going to be some kind, the state is always going to play a role, and partly because as imperfectly as it does so, right? The country that we live in, it does, there are a lot of sort of benefits that the government provides, right? So it collects information for that purpose, it shares information for that purpose. But I think that's one of the things that we're sort of always trying to figure out is how do you enable those functions of the state without having what always happens, which is sort of the data creep and surveillance creep, where the technologies that are developed and the kind of data collection mechanisms that are developed inevitably then feed into kind of the criminalization and penalization of, whoever either is the next group that's kind of trying to fight for its rights, or the group that has sort of come to the attention and has created a backlash. And it's very hard to have those kinds of protections in a surveillance state.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the ways in which privacy has become, in the kind of area of reproductive justice, a relatively impoverished vantage point to make a claim, and maybe always was. But privacy seems core in sort of what you're saying. I mean, the difference between people's private, intimate choices and sort of the public surveillance of it. And so is privacy something that the Brennan Center, is that a central tool?
Yeah, and to some extent, I'll defer to Cindy on sort of like the history of privacy and like is privacy sort of the right conception to like support our access to reproductive care? Apparently, it is not. So it ended up being quite problematic. But yeah, I mean, I do think privacy is also, I just think it is, I mean, one of the other things that I was thinking of as I was thinking about sort of democratic values, I think a basic democratic value is human autonomy and dignity, right? And I think there is no way to kind of realize a full level of autonomy. Privacy truly is, I think, a fundamental human right. Even if there isn't, even if you don't feel that, day to day there is some aspect of your life that you can't live out without privacy, it's part of how we, experiment and make mistakes and figure out who we want to be with and what we want to do and what we want to try out. Like, privacy is so core to that, and privacy certainly is a very significant thing that we kind of focus on within the Liberty and National Security Program. It's a common thread through a lot of issues is how do you protect privacy, and how do you have sort of an appropriate balance between, as I always think of it, like, do we know enough about what the government and the state is doing, and do they know not too much about us, just enough, and enough to kind of facilitate the things that we need to get from it, but we need to have kind of an appropriate balance of information sharing and also privacy.
Thanks. So Cindy, I'm going to ask you also to describe a little bit about your work and where you're coming from, and then to answer sort of a version of the same question that I asked Rachel, which is how does your perspective on sort of the state of reproductive justice, gender justice more broadly, illuminate kind of the state of democratic values and human rights? And again, is the Constitution doing its work?
Okay, all right, there's a lot there.
I gotta just throw it out there.
Well, hi everyone, I'm really excited to be here. I am currently a professor at CUNY School of Law, where I teach the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic, and my trajectory really has been a focus on human rights in the United States, which I think when I first started doing human rights in the United States, people thought that was weird, because there was sort of this idea human rights is about other countries, constitutional rights is about the United States, right? So part of the work that I was doing starting in 2001 was really thinking about how human rights law and standards really are better than the United States in many ways, which I'll talk about a lot. And then the other trajectory of my work is reproductive rights and justice. So I was the director of the US legal program at the Center for Reproductive Rights for about 3 years. And it was actually because the center was really interested, had done a lot of work around the world and really wanted to think about how to integrate human rights ideas into the US legal program. And okay, so first I just want to respond in terms of, you're absolutely right, in terms of, the right to abortion sort of grew out of privacy jurisprudence in the Supreme Court, but really I think developed much further, and really, I think, by Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which I'll talk about in a minute, was really more about personal autonomy. And there's a really important difference between privacy, because I think privacy, maybe it's also because it's a word with many definitions. right? Because sometimes when we talk about privacy, that's sort of like the state can't come in and get information about you. But I think there's another way to look at privacy which relates more to autonomy, right? That there are certain personal decisions that a person makes that they, and control over their own body, right? And that's really what autonomy is about. The Supreme Court, there were sort of two strains of cases. One was about control over your own body, and then one was about making intimate decisions, right? But I think it's really better understood as autonomy, and also because I think privacy sort of indicates like we don't want the state to be involved. And I think, honestly, for a lot of people, to have reproductive justice or reproductive freedom, you actually might need the state to be involved. And I'll talk about that in a minute in terms of like affirmative state obligations to help people realize their reproductive decision making. So I was just thinking, about this question about, is the Constitution an effective guarantor of rights? So that's a great question, and I feel like there are long-standing critiques, and then I think there are specific critiques that relate to the moment that we're in right now. Reminder, we have the oldest constitution in the world, right, 1789. When it was written, none of us were the rights holders or the rights holders that were that people had in mind, and slavery was part of the fabric of the country, right? And then we had major amendments to the Constitution right after the Civil War. Again, women could not vote until 50 years later, right? So there's a real question whether or not like this is a document that can really protect the fundamental rights of all of us. And I think that there was like a good partial answer in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the 1992 case, thank you, where the Supreme Court reaffirmed Roe versus Wade. And in that case, the court said that we must ensure that the Constitution protects all individuals, male or female, from unjustified state interference. And I think at that moment, what the court was saying was, the 14th Amendment protects a right to liberty, but we really need to think about, well, what does liberty mean for all bodies, right? Bodies, women, bodies with uteruses, right? And the court said that the ability to decide whether or not to continue a pregnancy was a fundamental liberty. But again, like thinking about what does liberty require, right? For people who weren't, slaveholding, Thomas Jeffersons, right? So that was sort of the state of play, and then we get Dobbs versus Jackson, right? And in that case, which is the Supreme Court case that came down over the summer, the court just is not concerned at all about what liberty requires, right? There's no discussion. I don't know if have people read the decision, or they've probably heard takes on the decision, right? There's like no discussion at all about like the rights of people who are pregnant, people who have the potential to become pregnant, and how taking away the right to end a pregnancy really violates their rights. And what the court said was that in order to determine whether a right was protected by the Constitution, they were going to look back to see whether abortion was legal in many states, right, in 1869. Okay, so like there's a major problem with that. So that's like, so that's the moment we're in. But there's one other point that I wanted to make, which was that, there were problems with Roe versus Wade. And there are reproductive justice activists, women of color, have been very active before the Dobbs decision, talking about how the Roe standard was never enough, right? Because what the Roe standard does is it says that we have a right, negative right protection, right? And that the state can't make abortion illegal. But there's no obligation for the state to remove barriers that prevent people from accessing reproductive health services and abortion. And in fact, even with Roe versus Wade, what happened was not only did the state not have any positive obligations to think about, do we have enough reproductive health care providers, right? In rural areas, do we need more doctors or do we need more nurse practitioners? But also, states were actually allowed to pass laws making it more difficult for people to get access to abortion, right? So like you would think, if you had a right to abortion, states shouldn't actually be imposing unnecessary waiting periods, right? States shouldn't be passing laws that put immense regulatory burdens that force clinics to close, right? So all of those things were totally fine under Roe versus Wade. And so what reproductive justice activists, and they also sort of argue that we should be thinking about the full range of reproductive choices, right? Not just the ability to not become a parent, but also to parent if you want to. And I think for many people, many communities, actually, the state has actually interfered with their ability and not supported their ability to have children. But that we should be thinking not just about the bare legal right, but whether or not people actually have access. So I feel like that's another critique of the Constitution.
Thanks. So you've both spoken to this a little bit, but I'm going to ask you maybe to expand upon it and think about your work through the lenses of the other person's work. And so to think about, Rachel, I'll come back to you, to think about the ways in which your work on surveillance technologies has particular implications for women or intersects with gender, either in the context of reproductive rights, you've talked a little bit about it, but more broadly speaking.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm actually going to take a little bit of a different angle on this. And we have certainly been thinking about, especially since Dobbs leaked and then, Dobbs came out. Although I want to refer to it instead as Jackson Hole Women's Health, right? Jackson Women's Health? Dobbs versus Jackson. Yes, and there's been a little bit of a push, I think, not to refer to it by Dobbs's name, but instead by the name of the health clinic. So for what it's worth.
Well, they didn't win, so they might not want to.
Well, that is fair. That is fair. So certainly one of the things that we've been thinking about is sort of what will the implication be of all of these surveillance technologies in kind of a post-Dobbs world where there's really going to be a push, right, to prosecute and to criminalize abortion and sort of thinking through that a little bit more. I think the piece, especially since I know this is something that Cindy has been thinking about and doing a lot of work on, is thinking about a slightly different angle on this, which is actually the pervasive surveillance of poverty and of people in poverty. So there's a really interesting, this was sort of something I had on my mind, there's a really interesting article in the Post, I don't know, maybe a week ago now, in the Washington Post, about, they've done an investigation on the use of surveillance cameras in public housing to enforce basically rules in public housing. And a lot of those rules are around like who can be in and out of a unit that somebody has, who's staying overnight, things like that. And they documented that there were some kind of public housing areas that had concentrations of surveillance cameras that rival those at prisons, right? So places that are literally built for surveillance and punishment. There was a similar concentration of cameras in some of these public housing kind of units and developments. And that they were being used basically to punish. Some of them have facial recognition technologies built in, right? So maybe they can see like, oh, there are certain people who aren't supposed to be coming into this area, and so now we can actually use facial recognition technologies to see if they're there. And it's probably obvious how this especially affects women, but I had just sort of, pulled out a few statistics. So 75% of households receiving public assistance are headed by women. And then especially when you get to kind of the intersection of women and communities of color, about half of all Section 8 residents, so residents receiving housing vouchers, are either Black or Hispanic. And there is this long history, right, of kind of surveilling communities of color and really enforcing kind of social norms and obligations through surveillance and ways in which those affect communities in poverty. And so I think and it was interesting to me, both in this Post article and then I'd read sort of a separate study that was related that I want to touch on, every single sort of case study that was referred to, everyone that was interviewed for what is it like to be under constant surveillance was a woman. They were all of the ones who were being impacted by the use of these cameras. And there are a couple of sort of threads that I just want to pull out briefly. One is the fact that facial recognition technologies are being used. Those technologies are notorious for functioning best on white male faces, and then it goes down from there, right? So they are less accurate with female faces, and they're less accurate with people of color, and they're least accurate with women of color. There are some technologies that have gotten very sophisticated and are actually very good across all, kind of demographic and gender and racial groups. I suspect those are not the ones that are being used by random public housing authorities in various cities because they're expensive. And so the ones that they're getting off the shelf are much more likely to be performing more poorly on the very people that they're kind of surveilling and targeting. And the other piece is this long thread of man in the house rules, right? So these were, kind of old rules. The Supreme Court officially overturned in 1968, but basically saying that if families, especially women receiving welfare, had a man in the house, that they were not allowed to receive welfare benefits, at least not allowed to receive as much, but I think often not allowed to receive any, right? And there was physical surveillance and control of literally people coming into houses to say, is there a man here, right? Is there somebody who's spending the night? Is there somebody who's hiding here? Because if there is, we will strip your welfare benefits because it's the man who's supposed to be earning the salary and supporting the family. The woman's supposed to be taking care of the kids. So if there's a man, the woman is no longer entitled to those benefits. That specific rule was overturned, but in this article and just sort of in general and reading about the surveillance, it's a lot of those same kinds of norms that are still actually being enforced through surveillance. So multiple women saying, one of the conditions of my living in public housing is that I not have any overnight guests or not have overnight guests for more than a certain number of nights during the year. So a woman who was interviewed who was divorced from her husband, but they were still on good terms, and he was helping with parenting and was sort of keeping together the family. And as part of that, he was staying overnight sometimes. He was with the kids. He was in and out. And literally, the Public Housing Authority basically set up a very targeted, almost surveillance sting. Not just did they have the regular cameras that were set up in the Public Housing Authority, they set up a separate surveillance camera that was focused at her back door to see if he was like coming in and leaving through that. And so, thinking about these women-headed households who are already going through so many hurdles to prove that they're entitled to benefits because there is such a presumption of sort of guilt almost if you're trying to get access to those benefits, and then dealing with this constant surveillance to see if they are doing anything that would suffice to sort of strip those from them.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cindy, I'll ask you to think about your work from the lens of kind of how surveillance technologies and social media kind of implicate reproductive rights.
Okay. And also just want to say, like...
You can change my question.
No, but I feel like your comments were right on point. And, there's a scholar, I think, people know Kara Bridges. Mm-hmm. She wrote this book called the Poverty of Privacy Rights, but it's really just about like the privacy rights that we think that we have. Like anyone who relies on government benefits really loses that. And in my work, like I've seen this also in terms of pregnant people who go to the hospital and who ends up being drug tested, right? It's people who go to public hospitals. It's people of color. So sorry, going back, to the topic. Well, like on the good side, I feel like the internet has had some positive things for reproductive rights and health. In terms of just making information about medication abortion, do people know about medication abortion rights, two-pill regime, and has really made abortion and self-managed abortion incredibly safe, right? So like, a lot of people when people were afraid of Roe being overturned, there was a discussion about, we don't want to go back to the coat hanger. But the reality is that people actually can safely self-manage abortion if they have access to the pills and if they have information. So the good thing about the internet, it really has made information available to people both about what's legal and illegal in their states. Because after Dobbs, it was crazy. Every day, the rules were different. I mean, people had appointments. They were getting canceled at the last minute because there were laws that went into effect, and then there were instantaneous injunctions, and then the injunctions were lifted, and people were going nuts, right? But also, people need information about where they can safely self-source if they can't actually get abortion pills, and these websites actually provide the information. And also tell them, what to look for. So I think that's been one incredibly positive thing about the internet. I think the internet also creates the opportunity for misuse. And so do people know about crisis pregnancy centers? Yeah, okay, everyone, okay. So just this idea that often when people would do Google searches, they would search abortion, right? And crisis pregnancy centers would be the first that would come up. And these are fake women's health centers. There aren't any doctors there, right? And they're really about dissuading people from having abortions, shaming them, often getting information that might be shared with their loved ones. And they also employed things like geofencing, which was when people went to abortion clinics, like they would know their location, and so they would target them for anti-abortion ads, right? So these are really harmful things. And then the last thing I just want to touch on, I feel like there's been a lot in the news about surveillance, period trackers, and also getting information. I don't think there's like a unique danger for people who want to have abortions. I think it's actually a wake-up call for us to recognize what other communities have been dealing all along. And I think it's actually an interesting moment for reproductive rights activists to think about the level of surveillance, because it's not anything that's unique that's being done to pregnant people who are suspected of having abortions, right? This idea that your internet searches or your email records can be subpoenaed, that happened already, right? And it's just a question of like, now it can happen to you or your daughter, and this is getting people angry. And so I think it's actually kind of an interesting moment for us to come together with people who have been fighting, like you, about surveillance technology.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to hold off on more. I have more questions, but I do want to kind of stop, because it's been a lot, and sort of give you a moment to think, and turn it over to the audience to see if people have questions. And hope I can't really. My son is
very blinding.
Yeah, it's very blinding. But maybe you could introduce yourself and oh, good. People are managing this for us. Excellent.